Packy McCormick, congratulations on your essay on Scenius. We're going to be talking about that today. And first, I want to hear about the inspiration for this essay. I know that it ties in with a lot of things that you've been thinking about and working on for the past couple years. And then let's start talking about the epiphany that was Hype House.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for putting together the fellowship. This has been, I think, probably the hardest writing experience I've had in the past year, but really, thanks to the group and thanks to Tom, who was my editor, we've gotten into a place that I feel really great about. So thanks again for kind of pushing us to write.
Fantastic.
But yeah, so the whole kind of journey started for me last year. I was on a call with Andy Matuchik, and I was telling him about the thing that I wanted to work on, which was this community of smart, curious people coming together in a physical place, connected digitally, but really coming together in a physical location, and ultimately kind of scaling this thing around the country to kind of provide continuing education and extracurriculars as people go through life so that we don't get more and more boring. As I was explaining the concept to him, he was like, "You've heard of the term Scenius, right?" And I hadn't heard of the term Scenius. And he was like, go look up Scenius." And so after we got off the call, I looked up Scenius. It's this term coined by Brian Eno, who's a musician and music theorist and kind of like just one of those guys who's always coming up with these things that kind of like the edge of the future. And so I looked it up, and it's this idea of communal genius. So if you look back throughout history to ancient Greece, to Les Ineffaux in Paris in the 1920s, to Silicon Valley itself, to Bell Labs, all of these different places are these examples of groups of people coming together and accomplishing more together than they would have been able to alone. And that's what Scenius is. And so this thing fascinated me because I've been exploring education, I've been exploring community, and all of these things kind of come together in the concept of Scenius. So decided to do that as my essay topic. And I think the thing you're referring to about the Hype House, so I was reading an article in January by Taylor Lawrence, and that's how I started the piece about the Hype House, which is a group of, I think, 18 people, TikTok stars who either live together or come to this house when they're in town and create TikTok videos together. And at first, I think as a 33-year-old now, when you read something like that, you're like, silly. Like, this is a bunch of like TikTok people coming, like figuring out how to twerk better together or whatever. And then I kind of went back through my essay and I was like, wow, this is how a lot of these things start, are these weird little communities that are protective of each other, that allow each other to take risks, that exchange tools and techniques with each other. Like, this is kind of what the beginning of Scenius looks like. And it doesn't necessarily mean that in 100 years, 1,000 years, people will look back and say, remember the Hype House. They changed the way the video was made forever. And the reason that we all talk in 15-second videos now, and that's how we communicate, is because of this group of people in Los Angeles. But I think, throughout history, there are these times where at the very beginning, this group of people come together and they're trying to make something new happen, and they need each other to make that happen. And so if you look back, somebody will get credit. There's, I think Charlie is her name, is the biggest TikTok star, but she's surrounded by all of these other people who are helping her become better. And so if you look back and hear about Ben Franklin, he obviously gets a lot of credit, deservedly, but he had a group called the Junto, which came together every week and came up with the idea for the volunteer fire department and the library and the University of Pennsylvania. And those things wouldn't have happened without this group of people. And if you look back kind of at all the great moments of progress, or most of them, there are these groups of people around the people who get a lot of the credit, and those are the scenia.
Yeah, I think that there were two examples that stuck out to me as I was reading the essay. And the first was what happened between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And they were members of the club called the Inklings at Oxford. I thought that was really interesting. And then also wild to see how a little town in Scotland actually bred the Scottish Enlightenment. And so talk about what happened with the Inklings, and then talk about how you had Edinburgh, which had only 40,000 people, and then all of a sudden you get Adam Smith, you get David Hume, and you get this intellectual renaissance happening right around 1745.
Absolutely. So to start with the Inklings, really it's a group of people who came together as Christian writers. And so it was very early on, before The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or the Chronicles of Narnia in general, before The Lord of the Rings, a few different Christian writers in England, whether they were at Oxford or at London, found each other and decided that they wanted to meet regularly. And so people came up from London to meet at Oxford, and then the people who were there. So they met once a week in essentially kind of a dorm room. And then they met once a week in the morning at a bar called the Eagle and Child. And they would just get together and kind of read what each other had written over the past week, or bounce ideas off of each other, just discuss what it was like to be a writer and a Christian at the time. And so J.R.R. Tolkien, in the beginning of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, gave credit to the Inklings and to C.S. Lewis in particular for pushing him to finish the trilogy. Because when you think about Lord of the Rings, he's coming up with a new world, a new language. Like it's this big, meaty project. And so he relied on these people to kind of push him through it. Interestingly enough, he actually was not a big fan of the Chronicles of Narnia. They were released a little bit after the Inklings broke up. And so maybe he would have had an impact on that. And maybe they would have, the Chronicles of Narnia would have turned out differently had the Inklings still been meeting as regularly. But he ended up not being as big of a fan of the Chronicles of Narnia. So that was interesting. And then, to Scottish Enlightenment, you go back to Scotland in the mid 1700s, and Edinburgh is this backwater town essentially at the time. And then all of a sudden, really within kind of the course of a decade, as Scotland kind of came under England's rule, but were ruled from afar, so they have this kind of governmental security, but also, I think, distance, which I think was an important combination, that they weren't being watched over too closely, but they did have the support of a strong central government. They grew to dozens upon dozens of taverns in town, and went from this small nothing town. Like, think about, I don't want to talk down on any town, but a really small town in the middle of nowhere, essentially, that in 10 years kind of, gave us modern economics, capitalism, philosophy. And it's the same idea of people meeting regularly in bars in this town and exchanging ideas off of each other. And so you see philosophy impacting economics, you see economics impacting philosophy, geology. Like, there's all of these smart people. The odds that all of these smart people, the world's smartest people, were all born in this same little backwater in the middle of Scotland, this little island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, tiny. But these people come together, reinforce each other, support each other, exchange tools, techniques, tips, support the kind of novel ideas that each other has. And all of a sudden, you have this impact on the world that's far greater than anybody would have been able to do alone in that time, in that place.
Yeah, one of the things that you grapple with in the essay is two different versions of history. There's the great man theory of history, and then there's the Scenius theory of history. And you take the side of Scenius. You have this line in there where you say something along the lines of, quoting people who would take the opposite side, oh, Michelangelo would have been Michelangelo anywhere. And what you say is, no, not quite. Yes, you need intelligence. Yes, you need creativity, but you need certain conditions to emerge. And when you talk about the Scottish Enlightenment and what led to Hume and Smith, talk about what some of those conditions are. You talk a little bit about change. You talk a little bit about these new beacons of hope for a future, generally propelled by something in the past that was a problem that then became a catalyst for that change.
Absolutely. So I think this is kind of the central point of the essay. So we'll take a step back here. So in 2008, right after Brian Eno had coined the term Scenius, Kevin Kelly wrote a piece in the Technium kind of deconstructing Scenius and saying, here are the things that take place every time Scenius occurs. And they are local tolerance for the novelties, a rapid exchange of tools and techniques, mutual appreciation. He talks about, so he comes up with these ingredients. And then he talks about a few of the examples. And at the end of the essay, he says, but you can't really make Scenius happen. Like, these are kind of the things that have happened when Scenius has occurred. But the best that you can do if you see Scenius occurring is don't ruin it. Don't get the lawyers involved. Don't give it a fancy office. Just let these magical little times and places happen. And so really what I wanted to do with the essay, in the beginning, my stance was strong and it was like, no, you can make Scenius happen. And here's how you make
Hmm.
Scenius happen. I think where it came to is that these conditions, like you're saying, do have to be in place. You do need incredibly smart people to be involved, but there are incredibly smart people everywhere. You do need the government to be, we talk about the Scottish Enlightenment, that the government was both strong but not overbearing. So it has to at least be friendly to innovation, but it can't be actively stopping it. I can't think of an example where that was not the case. And so the underlying conditions have to be right. And then I wanted to look for other ingredients of Scenius that were present in all or most of these cases that now when people are coming together in groups of intelligent people trying to change the way that a particular industry or art form works, they can notice that maybe they are the beginning of a Scenius and apply some of these ingredients. So the four that we came up with are competition, place-based ritual,
Hmm.
emergence from catastrophe, which we'll come back to, and I think that was kind of the glue that made this essay work for me, because right now we're emerging from coronavirus. So we got halfway through this essay, and to be frank, I was on the verge of giving up. Right, like I got halfway through, and I was like, I just don't know if we have it right now. Alex Danko wrote this great piece on innovation versus progress, where are these big things that move humanity forward, that are good for everybody. It's electricity. It's we go to the moon. It's these like big hairy things that don't just kind of benefit one class or another. Contrasting that to innovation, which is almost, he writes about it as this arbitrage where people figure out kind of holes in the system where they can just get in and make money. So Uber does make life more convenient, but what it's really, really good at is taking this thing that we do, take taxis, put it on an app, build a company that's worth $60 billion. And so there's
Hmm.
these innovations that are maybe good for everybody, maybe not, that's arguable and to be seen, but they feel more like tweaks than like big shifts. And so it felt like we had gotten to this place where innovation was kind of the norm and big progress wasn't happening. I've heard you speak about this before. A lot of people talk about the fact that since the 1970s, kind of progress has gone off a cliff, and there are many reasons for it. And I wasn't sure that halfway through this essay that actually it was possible right now to make Scenius happen. And then the coronavirus hit. And so if you look back, and I look back at kind of all the examples, I had this table of all the Scenia. It ended up down to 13 just so it didn't take up my entire essay. But in 11 of the 13 cases, they had come directly after this like big, hairy, awful event. So Scenius emerges from war. So you can trace Building 20 at MIT and Bell Labs all the way through Silicon Valley. They all came out of World War II and the need to develop technology to defeat the Axis powers. And so that's one example of this thing comes together. Everything that people are doing stops. You focus on this one thing. And then out of that thing, not only do you solve that one thing, not only do you solve the war, but you build these structures and these processes of working together that persist over time and build on each other. And to the point now where you can trace a direct line from the war to Bell Labs to Shockley Semiconductor, all the way
Hmm.
through to the iPhone and to the fact that we're on Skype right now having this conversation. And you can do that kind of throughout history. The bubonic plague, like all of these things, all these awful periods that must have seemed particularly dark at the time, within sometimes a decade, sometimes a little bit longer than a decade, you have the greatest kind of moments in the history of the world for progress. And so, coronavirus, I think, is that thing for us. These crises are a big reset. Everybody has gone from worrying about their daily lives, getting caught up in their routines, to having to stop, having to pause, and having to consider kind of what's important. And so one of the big shifts is, again, we're talking like this online. That is kind of the way that everybody's communicating. So if we're all going to be communicating online, how do you make that experience better? Can you replace kind of place-based ritual meeting in a bar in Scotland with Zoom or Skype or whatever technology you choose? So anyway, got your
One
thought.
of the things that I was thinking a lot about as I read the essay that you didn't touch on as much was money. And say in Florence, you had the Medici family, and there was a certain amount of money that people were competing for. And then in Silicon Valley now, when I look at the angel investor scene, basically what happens is people come here and there are these feedback loops where it's very easy to raise money here if you have a halfway good idea and a couple connections. Because what happens is you build a business, and then it's basically implied and assumed that you become an angel investor. So if you go look at these Series A rounds or even seed rounds, and you go look at the funding documents, so often you'll see the CEO of a company in an adjacent field who was the first money in right there. So even
Totally.
with Circle, which is the platform now where we host the Rite of Passage community, Circle was funded by Sahil, who's the CEO of Gumroad. First Check-In was the CEO of Teachable. Sahil was the vice president of technology at Teachable. And even as I read your essay, looking into Motown, Motown launched the careers of so many artists: Michael Jackson, The Temptations, Diana Ross, The Supremes, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Neil Young. And what you have is, you said that 8 of Rolling Stone's 100 greatest artists, they were Motown artists. And this all happened in just a small little neighborhood in Detroit over a 13-year period. So even with Motown, how much of Motown was residue from the industrial boom that happened in Dearborn, Michigan, with Ford, with General Motors? I just kept on thinking, how does money factor into all of this?
It's such a good point. So one of Kevin Kelly's kind of 4 factors for nurturing Scenius is what he calls network effects of success. And so I think when you talk about the Circle example, that's exactly what that is. That's people doing well, maybe making a little bit of money, giving back, funding the next company, that company going and doing well. It's one of the reasons that Silicon Valley works. It's one of the reasons now that I think New York just crossed its fourth decacorn, a company worth $10 billion. How that system is going to continue to kind of grow and improve, that people make money, they give back into the system. I think money is certainly an important factor. I now want to look into this one a little bit more, but I think whether it's money or whether it's whatever kind of public marker of success that people within the group are able to achieve, they give back. And so if you look at Motown, I think that's a really good point, that it happened while Detroit was booming. Another thing is that if you're Marvin Gaye, you can collaborate with an up-and-coming artist and give them some of your fame and bring them up that way. So I think it's whatever kind of public residue of success that you're able to achieve, you give that to others within the group who are trying to do the same thing, trying to make a name for themselves. And so in many cases, that's money, and money is the most direct, but I think there are other ways that the network effects of success work within Scenius as well.
Yeah, why don't we talk about Rite of Passage? It's just so convenient too. So basically, obviously you wrote this as part of the Rite of Passage Fellowship, and when I started Rite of Passage, I'd always wanted a place where people could come together to write together, because there was a lot of good factual information online about how to write. Like, it's all there. This is what you do. The books are cheap. This is how you start a blog. The blogs are free. This is how you should think about building a personal website. The examples are all out there. But I realized that doing anything difficult consistently looks a lot more like fitness. And basically what I still really want to do with Rite of Passage is to basically replicate CrossFit for writing, where in CrossFit you go and you learn how to do deadlifts, how to do all the CrossFit exercises, kettlebells, whatnot, for 5 weeks, and then you show up and you continue your membership, and people keep on going because they all know each other and it's a communal experience. And to use your terminology, there's a element of scenius there. And even with the way that people are beginning to engage, like this week you did a collaboration with another student, and people are beginning to come together and actually create these new ideas. And it's really cool. And so let's just sort of riff on what we're seeing with Rite of Passage. And actually, I'm curious, like, if you were a consultant for Rite of Passage based on this essay, what should I be thinking about in terms of 2 or 3 variables that I should be focused on?
Yeah, so I Rite of Passage, I think, was one of the reasons that this concept resonated so much when I heard it, because I heard it right around the time that I had just finished going through the Rite of Passage cohort. Rite of Passage is one of the examples that I talk about,
Mm-hmm.
not because this is part of the fellowship, but really because it's one of the places where I've seen a lot of the elements come together, and I write about that and talk about how particularly three of the ingredients come together in Rite of Passage. But I think one of the most interesting things is that uh, in Scenius in general, when you take it online, there are all these ideas that were certainly kind of came about because of these local communities. And so if you think of local tolerance for the novelties is one of Kevin Kelly's ingredients, that means that you have a group of people around you who are able to let you try weird things until you figure something out. And that would be local. They'd protect you. Maybe somebody in the group has connections, and they protect you as you try experiments or try new forms of art, push the boundaries. Rite of Passage kind of does that online. I think one of the things that everybody in the class talks about with each other is how weird it is to start writing and publishing and putting your ideas out there for the first time. A lot of people think, I don't have anything important to say. Why would people listen to me, et cetera, et cetera. And so the fact that you have this group of people around you who are like, go try it. And if you want to invert your blog and write an essay backwards, like, why not? Try it. We'll give you feedback on it. I'll give you likes on Twitter. We'll retweet you. So you have this kind of system around you. When some people do well, they bring up other people. Like, there's all these things that Kevin Kelly talked about that I think come into play. And then I think there's the four ingredients that we have. So if you look at Rite of Passage, competition, one. So one of the reasons that I think I stuck with it, and I've written my newsletter every week and kept writing, and just it's a big part of my life now, is because early on in the course, you had called out an essay that now when I read it, I'm like, that was fine. But you called it out as being kind of one of the example essays that people should look at. And so that's a non-zero sum competition. You didn't say Packy wrote better than Sarah, but it felt like competition to me. Or I was like, oh, cool, I'm kind of good at this thing. Like, I want to keep going and keep trying. So there's that. Place-based ritual is a second ingredient. And so historically, that means that these groups come together in these physical places, and they sit around a table, they sit around a dark bar. There's actually been papers, and I talk about it in the essay. There's a paper called Bar Talk that talked about the fact that when Prohibition occurred, and they could trace it because some counties were dry beforehand and some became dry during Prohibition, the amount of new patents given in communities that had become dry against their will dropped 8 to 20% in those counties. So innovation dies when you take away the bar. Mm-hmm. So it takes away these kind of informal settings where people build relationships and exchange ideas. And so you've, I think, done a good job with Rite of Passage when I took it of recreating that on Zoom. And then now I see each cohort as it evolves, and you can talk about this a little more if you'd like, but you have the online piece that is really kind of the starting point, but then people meet offline. So whether it's the Germany group or the New York City group or the San Francisco group of Rite of Passage students, they meet face to face, and then they continue to stay connected online. So you have this almost place-based ritual happening that is the best of both worlds. I don't think you can replace it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I don't think you can replace the in-person piece. I looked at both Rite of Passage and the Inner Intellect, which is another community of kind of public intellectuals from around the world. They also meet online and connect online and talk online, but rely on in-person salons when we're not, quarantined, rely on these in-person salons to really build those bonds. And so I think that's one of the really interesting things about Rite of Passage is seeing you evolve it to kind of take advantage of online and offline.
Yeah, one of the things that was striking in your assessment of Bar Talk was the way that hierarchies disappear in a bar. So if you even take Oxford and then the bar outside of campus, at Oxford, you have the president who is very clearly above in a hierarchy, above students. You have the PhD advisor who's very clearly above the candidate that they are mentoring. But once you get into a bar, there's a certain kind of round table equality that begins to happen. And so what you end up having is new ways that ideas are fused together in ways that we wouldn't have expected. First thing. Second thing is alcohol contributes to a kind of randomness of what happens. the prefrontal cortex is basically dimmed, and in a Freudian sense, the subconscious begins to activate and new things begin to happen, right? Like, this is when we're young and we're going out with people, funny things that you can't even believe that you would ever do happen when you're under the influence of alcohol. Of course, way too much of it becomes a problem, but I think that what you have with a couple drinks is the ability to come up with new ideas that you wouldn't come up with otherwise. And so to get into the digital aspect of Rite of Passage in particular, and I think now the frontier of this is the digital world is very good at allowing people to come together with a shared purpose. It usually works pretty well. So like, if you and I are chatting right now, we can have a conversation. I'd say this is probably 70% to 80% of what of the fidelity that we get in real life, but it's so much more efficient that it's absolutely a smart thing to do. But the digital world is very good in the middle. It's not good on the edges. So it's not good at, for example, this week, I have somebody flying to San Francisco because Will Mannon, my course manager, we have so much work to do that we have to be in person to make critical creative decisions. And that is convergent. So we have an idea of exactly what we want to do. So there's that, which the digital world hasn't been able to replicate. And then, because that's very tactile, but then there's a certain kind of creativity that comes from the sort of sit back, put your head back, and just walk and wander that the digital world also doesn't really allow. There's not really an ability to just hang out bar style or go for a big hike where you're like, your brain is sort of wandering. You say things without even realizing that you're saying things, and it's almost like an algorithm for randomness. And so to get back to Scenius, I think Scenius needs both of those things, and that's where the digital world is a limiting factor right now.
Totally. And I really came into this essay first with kind of this perspective that, no, you can't do it online. Then I thought maybe COVID was actually going to be the unlock. We'd have to figure out how to make that magic happen online, because that's the only way they're communicating. And that was kind of the early optimism phase of COVID, where you're like, Zoom's awesome. I'm doing a happy hour on Zoom. I'm doing meetings on Zoom. This is so much fun. I don't have to travel anywhere, and I can meet with people around the world. But then I think you see, to your point, the randomness just isn't there. When you get onto a Zoom call, for the most part, it's either fun or it's work. It's either a random hangout with friends, or it's something that you have kind of a particular reason to be there for. And that kind of magical little conversation that happens, and just like the bullshitting that happens when you're in person with somebody, waiting for someone to clear out of the meeting room, waiting for the meeting to get started, like all the little things that happen just are removed. And I think a bar takes that a step further. You're not going to show up to a work meeting drunk, or hopefully you're not going to show up to a work meeting drunk and throw out those kind of crazy ideas. But yeah, I've come to this spot where I think really it's going to take a quantum leap in kind of the technology and our experience online for it to ever be able to replace kind of the magic of in-person. So I think the best communities, and you're doing this, and would encourage even more of this if I were a consultant, but the best communities are going to be the ones that do the kind of hybrid and figure out what the internet is best for and what in-person is best for, and do those two things together really, really well.
Yeah, last question. The word place has a really interesting role in your essay, because there's two ways of reading that word. The first way is that there's going to be a new place that is going to take over. So maybe it'll continue to be Silicon Valley, or maybe it'll be somewhere in Switzerland, somewhere like a new Shenzhen, something like that. This kind of new creative cluster. And there's another way of reading that, though, that I think is the more interesting way of reading it, which is that the internet becomes a place. And the way that we think about place is less focused on geography and more focused on interest. And basically, you can have multiple Sceniuses on Twitter, for example. So I'm a big fan of airplane Twitter. I'm in particular a big fan of commercial airplane Twitter, where they have the people freaking out over the new 777X leaving Spokane, Washington. I was looking at that plane yesterday. Or the aerial shots coming into LAX, I think are absolutely beautiful. And I love talking to airplane geeks on Twitter. And so the thing is, that is its own kind of place, its own kind of interest-based community. And I wonder, what do you think the future of places here? Would you bet on a physical location, or would you say, you know what, we're past that now. The new places are going to be digital sceniuses?
That's a really good point. So in the essay, I draw the distinction between communities and scenius, and the big kind of differences are a community is what you're talking about with commercial airplane Twitter. It's a bunch of people passionate about the same thing, getting together and talking about it.
It's the best.
A scenius, it's amazing. I love community. I've written a lot about community. It's awesome. Scenius is like a couple levels of above that, where one, it's generative. So instead of talking about the Boeing 777X, you're creating the Boeing 807X. And then not only are you creating, I think that's kind of like a micro scenius, and that's a company in many cases, someone creating something new, but then it's influential. So then airplane designers for the next 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years refer back to that as kind of the new kind of paradigm for designing a commercial airplane. And that's when you get the kind of scenia that are like ancient Greece or like the Renaissance, where the Scottish Enlightenment, which we've talked about, where 300 years later, we're referring to the invisible hand and the different concepts that Adam Smith came up with at that time. That's scenius. And if I had to bet on the internet or physical location, I really think it's going to be a combination of the two. Like I talk about Basecamp in the essay, they're mostly remote, and it makes it convenient. You can get the best talent from across the world to come work on your product. But then 3 times a year, twice altogether as a company, and then once in smaller groups, they have budget to meet in person and form those kind of trusting and strong bonds that you need, I think, to like really kind of get vulnerable and be creative with each other. So I would bet on a hybrid as the kind of place of the future, where you can meet people on the internet and you have exposure to. I mean, imagine being place constrained in Scotland, where it's days to get to the next nearest big city in London. Now you can connect the smartest person on airplanes across the world in a microsecond. And so that's awesome. But if you guys, I think, wanted to take that and start designing airplanes or consulting Boeing or X, Y, or Z kind of generative and influential thing, there's going to be an in-person component. So maybe that becomes, I've heard a lot of talk recently about these little communities of people who are interested in the same thing, living together outside of the city. Mm-hmm. They found each other across the internet, but maybe for a year at a time, they're coming and living together in a certain place and exploring different interests together in these really, really intense periods.
That's so maybe exactly what I'm doing for the next year. Exactly that. Exactly.
Where are you going to go?
We're going to Austin, Texas, and we're going to live on a farm. And it's a group of all these people. We all met online, and we're coming together, going to study a lot of philosophy and just be together as friends. And it's exactly what you're saying.
And so, yeah, tell me, this is actually awesome. Tell me why you decided to do that instead of continuing to just talk online.
Yes. So, well, part of it is that there's a certain convenience factor that I'd always wanted to live with friends, because learning communally is super helpful. And we were going to live together in Brooklyn. And then after the coronavirus epidemic hit, we said, you know what, let's pay a third of the cost, move to Texas, and just be together. And all of our companies are now remote. So the cost of doing this was way lower than it would have ordinarily been. But the reason why we wouldn't do it online is when you're grappling with deep questions, when you're grappling with the cutting edge of something, you don't know where that map is. And so when you're actually trying to create the map, it's a random process. Like, a lot of coming up with new ideas is having 90% of stuff be slightly wrong, getting feedback, and going through this process of trying to figure out what the outer edges of this map are. And I think that that's what we're really into, philosophy. And so that's what studying philosophy is, trying to figure this map out for ourselves. Whereas the internet is much better at talking about well-defined maps with clear agendas. And so even within Rite of Passage, that map gets bigger and bigger every cohort. And then when it's time to actually be creative, when things need to get tactile, we do come together. And progress is so hard, almost by definition, right? Because it means that we have to create a new map. And because it is so hard, you mentioned in the Bar Talk paper, 8 to 18% loss from not being able to go to bars. That 8 to 18% is the margin that actually matters when you're actually trying to create something new.
Completely agree. And I think that's the beauty, and obviously tragic event, all of that. But the beauty of something like a coronavirus, of something like World War II, is that it's this reset where it may have been really hard to coordinate with all of your friends to get them to move to Brooklyn, to convince them to pay the increased rent, to tell them to kind of uproot their lives and go do this new thing. We have this tabula rasa now where it's like, cool, I'm starting from zero. What do I want to design my life to be like? And I think that's what crisis or catastrophe gives you, and why crisis or catastrophe has preceded so many of history's great scenia, is because it gives you that opportunity to say, great, if I could decide for myself and for our group what the next 10 years are going to look like, starting from this blank slate, I get to do that now. And so I think that's beautiful that you guys are doing that, and that this is giving you the opportunity to do that.
Packy McCormick, congratulations on your essay.
Thank you.